is anything going to be safe from a potential US CBDC, right? And what I really want to elaborate on today is kind of the more, I'll say, fluid kind of category of access tiering, right? So to reiterate what exactly access tiering is, according to a paper published by the Office of Science and Technology from the White House, access tiering refers to the various features that a CBDC system offers that vary based on the attributes of a given transaction, right? And so the specific attribute we're talking about today is transaction amount, right? So how much are you spending for a given transaction, whatever it happens to be, right? And so kind of the idea behind access tiering is there's a hierarchy, in this case based off the transaction amount, that basically within certain ranges of how much you're sending, you get different characteristics, right? For whatever the transaction is, maybe you have to provide more ID verification or whatever the case may be, right? Maybe below a certain amount you get peer-to-peer capability, something they've talked about in the same paper, which as always will be linked in the description because I always put the sources in there. That's the whole point of the videos. But regardless, that sort of thing, right? And so one thing that I've noticed through reading these in this kind of specific category based on transaction amount is it's very fluid as opposed to the other ones, right? The other ones being like access tiering based off of counterparty, right? Like who you're transacting with, whether it be a business, another person, maybe a specific type of business, whatever it happens to be, right? Or even just your user profile, where it's kind of more of like, what are your demographics, that sort of thing that kind of defines your transaction. And I talked a little bit about that in a previous video, right? So there's that. So now to look at kind of the pros and cons of access tiering and try to understand this a little bit better, specifically with respect to tiering based off a transaction amount, right? And so basically, one idea with this is that users could conduct lower value transactions without having to provide as much, we'll say ID verification, without having to meet some requirements that you may need for larger transactions, right? So, and one thing to note is this kind of the threshold between each tier or possible tier that could happen with this type of access tiering, it's pretty arbitrary, right? I mean, they might have some reasoning between, like say they make it $600 or $1,000, whatever it happens to be, right? Whatever that threshold is between different tiers. It's rather arbitrary. And that's one of the things that I've noticed or one major point I'd like to make, I should say, is, what stops them in the future from just slowly taking it down, right? Kind of like if you look at the long history of income taxes, but that's a completely separate topic. We're not going to go down that rabbit hole. But anyways, right? So one of the, I'll say pros, because I'm trying to kind of at least stay parallel to their line of reasoning, just so we can try to understand it better, is that doing this by tiering based off a transaction amount, right? They're calling it a quote unquote unified way to assess risk, right? Because you're kind of taking the person itself out of it and looking at just the transaction. So no matter who's kind of doing it, right, in a way, as opposed to your user profile, which is you personally. So like access tiering based off a user profile where you're, I don't want to say personally liable, but kind of get the point across, right? To where basically what you're allowed to do is based off of you, not who you're sending it to, like it would be with access tiering based off a counterparty, but the transaction amount itself, right? So there's that. And another thing that always pops up with these, basically anything with a central bank digital currency, I've always seen something, it seems, about anti-money laundering or counter-financing terrorism, like that kind of compliance, so to speak. And what they have to say about this is basically, yeah, you could have the transaction amounts much lower, and they don't have to provide, or people don't have to provide as much ID verification for below a certain threshold. But in terms of money laundering, the transactions, as they say, for illicit reasons, could just be for smaller amounts and just do a higher volume of them. Like that doesn't really solve anything. And they say this might create new vulnerabilities and be difficult to implement, right? For their own words, right? And so I guess kind of the biggest talking point for access tiering based off a transaction amount is how much of a slippery slope it is. I mean, CBDCs in general are like that just as a whole, right? The whole thing's a slippery slope. But it's easiest to see it in access tiering based off a transaction amount because of how easily you can slide that scale up and down, because there's not really, the threshold's pretty arbitrary, especially now where there's not, it's kind of a proposed amount, so to speak, or not even amount, just kind of proposed looking at different design choices. Like nothing's really set in stone. They give some examples or kind of thought experiments, I'll say, about said CBDC, or like here's one version if we're looking for these type of design choices and so on. But I mean, it's nothing set in stone just yet, right? So even with this, what are some protections that could come in play, right? Specifically for this type of access tiering. So some that they gave were it could capture info about the sender, but not the recipient, right? So the opposite of tiering based off a the opposite of tiering based off a counterparty, right? Because the counterparty is not providing any data, right? Also, they bring this up a few times, is something known as zero knowledge proofs, and those could also be helpful especially from the privacy aspect of it, right? So that kind of being said, if you kind of like these more deep dive-ish type videos, looking more at very specific types of characteristics or attributes or possibilities for a potential US-based CBDC system, make sure to subscribe, comment below, feedback, everything. It's always nice. And the whole point of these is to really kind of provoke that discussion and to really try to understand them further, right? So this is kind of more of, I guess the videos itself is kind of initial thoughts and that sort of thing, but kind of the start of the study and trying to get it out there, right? So kind of doing that. With that being said, in the top right corner, I will put up a video for access tiering based off a user account. So that'll be up there, and I hope to see you guys there.